This is Kremlin Target USA. There are, at the present time, two great nations in the world, which seem to tend toward the same end. Although they started from different points, I allude to the Russians and the Americans. The American struggles against the natural obstacles which oppose him. The adversaries of the Russian are men. The former combats the wilderness and savage life. The latter civilization with all its weapon and its arts. The conquests of the one are therefore gained by the plowshare, those of the other by the sword. The American relies upon personal interest to accomplish his ends, and gives free scope to the unguided exertions and common sense of the citizens. The Russian centers all the authority of society in a single arm. The principal instrument of the former is freedom, of the latter, servitude. Their starting point is different, and their courses are not the same. Yet each of them seems to be marked out by the will of the heavens to sway the destinies of half of the globe. This was said by Alexis Charles Henri Maurice Clarel de Tocqueville in 1835. The United States is one of the very rare guiltless powers. America has set free territories that were under its jurisdiction. It has assisted in the liberation of many nations. It has helped almost every country you can name to save its independence and to restore its economy. In one way or another, the United States has displayed a generosity that is without parallel in the history. Now let us look at Soviet Russia. That country has set a knot every treaty it has ever signed. It has violated every principle of international law. It has never ceased working by subversive means to overturn the political order and to destroy the independence of other nations. It has, most notably of all, subjugated by force 9 countries of Europe, each of which has an impressive record of freedom and independence. It can be asserted without hesitation that Soviet Russia's aggressions are unmatched, both in number and in scope, and yet the United States is criticized and suspected throughout the greater part of the world, whereas the Soviet Russia has become the champion, if you please, of anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism, and become somehow the defender of the independence of states. This was said by Constantin Visaliunu, the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Romania, as he addresses the Assembly of Captive European Nations on September 24, 1958. Part 1. The Critical Challenge. Khrushchev said on July 4th at the reception of the American Embassy in Moscow in 1961, "My tongue is my secret weapon. Words are one thing, actions another. Good words are a mask for concealment of deeds." This last bit was said by Stalin in 1913. Chapter 1. Chapter 1. The scope of Kremlin propaganda. It is clear that the forces of communism are not to be underestimated in Cuba or anywhere else in the world. The advantages of a police state, its use of mass terror and arrest to prevent the spread of free dissent, cannot be overlooked by those who expect the fall of every fanatic tyrant. If the self-discipline of the free cannot match the iron discipline of the mailed fist in economic, political, scientific, and all other kinds of struggle, as well as the military, then the peril to freedom will continue to rise. It is clearer than ever that we face a relentless struggle in every corner of the globe that goes far beyond the clash of armies or even nuclear armaments. We dare not fail to see the insidious nature of this new and deeper struggle. We dare not fail to grasp the new concept, the new tools, the new sense of urgency we will need to combat it. And we dare not fail to realize that this struggle is taking place every day without fanfare in thousands of villages and markets, day and night, and in classrooms all over the globe. Too long, we have fixed our eyes on traditional military needs, on armies prepared to cross borders, on missiles poised for flight. Now it ought be clear that this is no longer enough, that our security may be lost piece by piece, country by country, without the firing of a single missile or the crossing of a single border. We intend to profit from this lesson. We intend to re-examine and reorient our forces of all kinds, our tactics and our institutions. Here in this community, we intend to intensify our efforts for a struggle in many ways more difficult than war. This was said by President John F. Kennedy to the American Society of Newspaper Editors in Washington, D.C. on April 20th, 1961.
My friends, if you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain a little. Number one, it's free. Two, there's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or your computer. Anchor will then distribute your podcast for you, so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many, many more. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you've ever been looking for to make a podcast in one place. Go ahead and download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started.
The statement I just read is the first top official recognition of the significance of the propaganda war that was being waged against us since it started some 56 years ago. It is also the first official declaration of intention to enter that war for the purposes of safeguarding our security. This declaration has a historic import and may well mark the turning point in the tides of political affairs among the nations of the world since the end of World War II. This choice of President Kennedy to enter fully into the propaganda war has profound implications for the future of the United States, because Kremlin propaganda poses the greatest threat to our security of any single force arrayed against us today. Kremlin propaganda outranks nuclear and space weapons because in the military field there is a stalemate. It rises above the USSR brand of communism because this ism constitutes only of the propaganda's operational parts. And perhaps its greatest danger for us lies in our failure to understand it. The Kremlin has fashioned out of propaganda the most powerful, non-military weapon of national aggression the world has ever seen. By blending the recruiting techniques for its communist agents with methods of psychological warfare to include political activation, agitation, infiltration, incitement to revolution, delusion, and subversion in political, trade, ideological, and cultural fields, the Kremlin has added a new dimension to the conduct of international relations. Consequently, Kremlin propaganda has become synonymous and interchangeable with USSR foreign policy in forwarding the centuries-old Russian attempt to extend her power beyond her borders. Since the United States is the strongest obstacle in her path to world conquest, we have been singled out as the chief USSR propaganda target and labeled the enemy. The vast Kremlin propaganda machine has been put to work to slander us abroad in order to cut down the respect and trust other people have in us, and thus reduce the effect of our foreign policy actions. As subversion, it has been directed to our own people to undermine our faith in our institutions and to confuse the issues in our relations with the USSR. And finally, it has been turned on the captive audiences inside the USSR and inside the captive nations of Eastern Europe, to inoculate them against the effects of any free world ideas which seep into their closed totalitarian societies. To the USSR goes the distinction of being the first to assault nations with the help of an all-prevailing political propaganda. The atheist leaders of the Kremlin imitated in the fields of politics what the leaders of the Roman Catholic Church, for instance, had been doing in the spiritual realm of religious faith. The definition of the Latin word propagandum shows that the Kremlin has managed to find a common base in semantics with the Church of Rome, and a common point of historical reference as well. Quote, any organized group to spread a system of principles, end of quote, is the first definition given by Webster to the word propagandum. It mentions the College of Propaganda, quote, a college instituted by Urban XV to educate priests for missions, end of quote. It is evident that the Kremlin regime looked back nearly 300 years to find a model for its own missions. It had been quick to grasp the vital importance of one ingredient in the organization of the Church of Rome, which enabled it to cross national borders, proselytizing through specifically selected citizens of foreign countries, having established its own quote, colleges of propaganda, end of quote. The Kremlin is continually training and, quote, educating, end of quote, foreign nationals for the purpose of political activation and subversion once they have returned to their native lands. Since these, quote, missionary workers, end of quote, of the Kremlin creed hold on to their citizenship, they cannot be kept out, and their activities can be curbed only with considerable difficulty in free societies. But the Kremlin's use of, quote unquote, communism as an instrument of propaganda and a facade for aggression is only part of the operational picture. The USSR has also used diplomacy as a channel and has corrupted the traditional and civilized practice of diplomatic courtesy and immunity. The entire USSR diplomatic and consular services, plus special representatives, are meshed in propaganda operations with those of international, quote, front organizations, local front groups, and local Kremlin communist parties. The combination is a fallacious one. The diplomatic immunity and free and unchecked customs entry of goods accorded to the overt Kremlin representatives is added to the freedom of political action accorded to the covert Kremlin agents because of their citizenship status. These two coordinated networks are directed by and report back to a remarkable two-headed Kremlin creation, the USSR Foreign Office and the Organization of World Communism. The overt forms of the latter were called the Communist Internationale, Comintern, until 1943, and the Communist Information Bureau, or Cominform, from 1947 until 1956. Both heads are subject to propaganda direction by the Section of Propaganda and Agitation, or Agitprop, which in turn is controlled by the current dictator and the Presidium of the Central Committee of the Kremlin Communist Party. Today, in the absence of a large formal staff headquarters for its world propaganda effort, the USSR holds periodic conferences, as it did in 1957 and 1961, to hand down the word to representatives from subordinate Kremlin communist parties in other countries. Most likely, in the early years before the USSR had pretensions as world power, these two governmental units were separate and competed with one another for bureaucratic precedence. In the past history of worldwide network organization, when Kremlin communism was the only communism and the USSR had a monopoly on the ism, the regime may have treated it as a real faith and may have given the nod to the Comintern over the Foreign Office. However, by the time Stalin formally disbanded the Comintern in 1943, in a deceptively pacifying gesture to his newly found allies, it would appear that the Foreign Office and the USSR foreign policy had taken the lead. Under the current direction, embassies, legislations, consulates, commercial and cultural offices of the USSR, as well as those of the captive nations of Eastern Europe, are used as guidance centers for propaganda under their safeguard of diplomatic immunity. They receive propaganda materials and money from the Kremlin, which they pass on to the front and party groups. Their personnel are careful not to be caught meddling too directly in domestic affairs of the country of their assignment for fear of being declared persona non grata and requested to leave. Top USSR government representatives are among its principal agents of propaganda. Khrushchev, on his highly publicized visits and in his frequent news-making declarations, Foreign Office representatives in their dramatic presentations at the United Nations, and diplomats in their personal contacts and occasional appearances, all have the primary objective of swaying public opinion and gathering allegiances. Those representatives, like the local Kremlin agents, are given thorough and expert training in propaganda at various stages of their career. Special courses and schools have been set up for just this purpose. Large sums of money are invested in this enterprise, but of course, the specific figures are kept secret for the various forms of Kremlin propaganda outside the USSR involving a quote unquote front and the quote unquote Communist Party groups. It has been roughly estimated in the 1960s that total expenditures approximated $2 billion, and the total personnel paid and voluntary numbered about 500,000. For purposes of comparison, it is noted that the Kremlin, with slight aid from Peking, spends $2 per year per free man to be subjugated, as against 2 cents per person per year for the world propaganda put forth by all free countries, of which the United States contributes 1.5 pennies. No criteria, number of schools and courses, amount of money or degree of indoctrination can be found to estimate the national investment in propaganda the USSR makes when she sends her subjects abroad. For every citizen who is permitted to travel beyond the heavily guarded frontiers is charged with one of two duties, or perhaps with both: to project propaganda or to collect information. Just as no activity in the USSR may be pursued as an end in and of itself, but must have in it a political quote unquote line or serve a political objective. So no performing artist, no scholar, no engineering traveler may abroad go or may consider himself simply a professional person. He is a propaganda or intelligence agent of the state. Comparison with the Eisenhower effort to make every American traveler an ambassador of goodwill provides an illustration of the difficulty our country has had and still has in coming to understand the meaning and significance of Kremlin propaganda. Only a politically naive people could hope to pit goodwill effectively against propaganda with a built in political line and objective. To the majority of our citizens, the very idea of propaganda is repugnant. We mix it up with espionage, and because we disapprove of spying, we personally feel we should not stoop to it. If our government must indulge in espionage as a means of survival in order to counter the espionage of other countries, then we condone the practice. But gathering information is for special government agents and does not touch those of us who are average citizens. We are inclined to accept the second definition of propagandum that is offered by Webster. Quote, a secret or clandestine dissemination of ideas, information, gossip, or the like, for the purposes of helping or injuring a person, an institution, a cause. End of quote. Thus, we assume all propaganda is quote unquote black, that it is disseminated in a clandestine, underhanded way, and we tend to dismiss it as dishonest and dishonorable. And because we disdain propaganda in general, we do not take the pains to analyze and understand Kremlin propaganda in particular. If we did so, we would discover how far beyond Webster's definition it has been developed, and how effectively it is being used against our national interests. This national tendency has been characterized as hiding behind our finger. Our history fails to equip us with the experience we need to understand the significance of propaganda in today's world of military peace and political war. We have developed a nation of workers, of contenders with the force of nature, not of politicians, of manipulators, of the relations between man and man. But if we are to come to exert the influence in the world which our society, our national character, our intentions and purposes merit, we must change and educate ourselves in propaganda. Human nature being what it is, letting the facts speak for themselves is not enough. The truth objectively set forth is no match for lies or half truths vigorously projected. We have been aware of this foible for a long time in the merchandising of detergents in a highly competitive market. It is time for us to recognize it in the conduct of our relations abroad. To get down to terms, we can even save our sensibilities from the taint of the clandestine and the underhanded in Kremlin propaganda if we will only analyze it closely. Not all of it is disseminated covertly. In fact, today by far the greatest proportion is sent forth openly and directly from the Kremlin, from TASS and the USSR Monopoly News Agency, from RT and Radio Moscow, the USSR state radio station, or is published officially in many magazines of many languages and distributed abroad with a Moscow dateline. It is this quote unquote white propaganda which is acknowledged, which is open and above board in dissemination, that we must deal with first. If we manage to penetrate its fraud and expose it to the world, much of the effect of the black brand of Kremlin propaganda will be nullified, and we will have taken a long step toward destroying this vast weapon of total and complete aggression.
Kremlin Propaganda Defined. Chapter 2. Kremlin propaganda succeeds in deluding many intelligent Americans on a number of strategic counts. The objectives of the USSR towards world conquest, the character of propaganda in the Kremlin sense, and the kind of methods used in applying it to our society. On the international scene, the hearts and minds of some well-informed Americans are beguiled by the image of a phony world, disarmament, or by the advantages of doing business with Khrushchev. They are led to feel that the USSR, through its facade of a worldwide party, can or will bring about the realization of these ideals. Until the Kremlin repudiates its proclaimed basic aim of world domination, these worthy Western American idealists and wishful thinkers will be traded upon cynically for the purpose of the USSR political expansion. On the domestic scene, some of our citizens, regardless of political persuasions, from the far left to the far right, are manipulated by the Kremlin to compete politically in terms of communism as a social doctrine. This action brings communism as an instrument of aggression into domestic politics. Has it contended over in terms of American interests, identifies the interests of an American group with the interests of the USSR, and thus creates an American political party out of an organization of Kremlin agents. Perhaps we are gullible and are too prone to assume everyone is honest until he proves himself otherwise, are too ready to overlook past lies, in our compulsion to feel that everyone in the world is basically good. Perhaps our predominantly European stock, with its openness and directness, makes us an easy, open target for the Kremlin propagandists, with their Oriental admixture. Perhaps it's this admixture which makes them able to think on two planes at once. Certainly, we frequently get lost in trying to follow the Russian mentality, with its simultaneous grasp and treatment of the actual and the theoretical. Whatever the explanation for our failure to understand this, we have no excuse for not familiarizing ourselves with what they frankly state about themselves, their intentions, and their methods of propaganda operations. Their intentions towards world conquest were set forth officially at the Second and Sixth Congress of the Communist Internationale in 1920 and 1928. It is obvious that the Kremlin hierarchy originated the project of world conquest, has been pursuing this goal ever since, and is determined to remain the dictator of dictatorships, of the proletariat. Let the Kremlin speak for itself from the 1920s. The Russian Soviet Republic is grouping around itself the Soviet movements of the workers of all countries, and all national liberation movements
of the colonial and subject countries. The USSR becomes the center of international revolution. In the event of the imperialist states declaring war upon and attacking the USSR, the international proletariat must retaliate by mass action and overthrow the imperialist governments with the slogan of dictatorship of the proletariat and alliance with the USSR. The international proletariat must be bound by the strictest international discipline in the communist ranks, which must find expression in the subordination of local interests to the decisions passed by leading bodies of the Communist Internationale. Then, with special reference to propaganda targets in the underdeveloped areas, these proclamations state boldly, it is a duty of the Communist Internationale to support the revolutions in its first stages. But if from the outset the leadership is in the hands of a communist vanguard, the revolutionary masses will not be led astray, but may go ahead through the successive periods of development of revolutionary experience. Finally, the following 2 points taken from these writings are worth noting. They hold in effect that the multinational socialist state, the USSR, will serve as a model for the future socialist world state, and that bourgeoisie ideology is forever trying to corrupt the citizens of the USSR, so it must be combated by revolutionary vigilance. The proclamations of these congresses constitute the Bible of the Kremlin system, which is followed today just as scrupulously as it was in the 1920s. From reading them, we learn 3 most important facts. First, communism, the applied, not the theoretical version, is Kremlin communism, not Yugoslav nor even Polish. The propaganda in its name, or on its behalf, is designed to benefit only the USSR. Second, as early as the 1920s, the Russian leaders in the Communist Internationale decreed that all communists would owe primary allegiance in time of war to the Russian Soviet Republic, and only secondarily to their own countries. Thus, every communist working for Kremlin communism is an agent of the USSR. Third, social doctrine has long since been abandoned as a principal issue of Kremlin proselytizing, although it has been retained as a major talking point in the more advanced societies. The real objective now is the organization of people in the non-communist world into a vanguard of agents. In the light of the statement and the USSR actions over the past 50-odd years, it is almost inconceivable that anyone would believe in her peaceful intentions, trust her word, or expect to make gains of the security of the world through negotiation or accommodation. The fact that these statements and actions have not had the effect they deserve on the thinking of the peoples of the free world, especially the Americans, is a tribute to the ingenuity of the Kremlin propagandists. They have managed to so confuse issues that inconsistencies, contradictions, and outright fraud are not fully understood, exposed, or penalized. To appreciate the character of Kremlin propaganda, we must get rid of our own conception of propaganda. We must not dismiss it with the observation of, oh, it is just words. All contacts amongst men are just words until people begin fighting and killing each other. Instead, we would come much nearer the mark by considering it what has been termed, quote, a total system of semantics, a multi-level apparatus of psychological warfare which demoralizes as it disorients. We must realize that the Kremlin has gone far beyond Goebbels in using falsified statistics. The quote-unquote smear and the quote-unquote big lie. Propaganda is no longer, quote, that branch of lying which succeeds in confusing your friends with quite deceiving your enemies. In the hands of the Kremlin, propaganda has taken on more attributes and is directed to deeper ends than we in the free world ever dreamed. It can be judged best from what the USSR really considers propaganda, agitation, and political activation to be. Her definitions throw light not only on the character of the total Kremlin operations called propaganda, but on its mechanics and the USSR foreign political objective and practices as well. This is a Soviet political dictionary from 1958. It gives the following definitions for these following words. Propaganda. the dissemination and elucidation of certain ideas, doctrines, and political theories. Propaganda is of a class and party character. Unlike agitation, propaganda engages in the dissemination of a broader body of ideas and in their more profound and thorough elucidation among a comparatively narrower circle of people. Agitation, a way of political influence over the masses by means of talks, reports, and speeches at meetings through newspapers, books, rallies, brochures, leaflets, the radio and motion pictures, etc. Agitation is distinctly on a mass scale and consists in the dissemination among the broad masses of a body of ideas, a knowledge narrower in scope and content than in propaganda. Thus, we may conclude that propaganda is used largely for recruiting party members and fellow travelers, while agitation is what, strictly speaking, is projected to the mass public in a free world. The two processes are considered inseparable, as indicated by the name and the USSR bureaucracy given the unit charged with these functions, called agitprop. If these two definitions appear imprecise, the impression has not been left to chance. The regime wishes to keep these activities in a fluid, elastic state in order to respond to the changing demands of the times and to developing situations. Propaganda agitation in the West is a living action as suggested by the description of agitation in the large Soviet encyclopedia of 1949 to 58. It reads as follows. In the capitalist countries, the arsenal of the imperialist bourgeoisie is a supplement to the means of state action upon the masses, aka the police, courts, prisons, etc., with the aim of strengthening and broadening the rule of bourgeoisie and enslavement of the laborers, having at their disposal completely the sole press, owning printing establishments, paper, cinema, radio, lecture halls. The bourgeoisie parties and their government from day to day sow lies among the workers and peasants. The imperialist bourgeoisie does not stop short of the most infamous means for psychological working over of public opinion, for deceiving and subverting the masses. In the United States, England, and other capitalist countries, agitation by the reactionary bourgeoisie is directed against the USSR, against the countries of people's democracies, against the communist parties, mass popular progressive organizations, the leading figures in science, culture, and the arts, fighting for peace and democracy. The American and English imperialists have unleashed the ideological preparation for a new aggressive war by the path of lying and humanity-hating agitation and propaganda. The imperialist aggressor seeks to disrupt the will of the freedom-loving peoples for a counteraction against the encroachment by the Anglo-American imperialists upon the national sovereignty and freedom of peoples. But even this combination of definition, description, incitement of agents, and self-justification does not quite confer upon agitation. The leverage and potential in the political field, which I witnessed in Romania, for instance. There, the agents had another name for their activities: political activation. And they endeavored to infiltrate and spread political activation into every field of human activity in the country. The Romanians who were being introduced to Kremlin totalitarianism found need for a more explicit connotation, but subjects of the Kremlin have long since passed the primary education stage, quote unquote. The political dictionary does not even address itself to the word political when defining political activation. It is simply, quote, perception of action, transference from a static condition to a moving one. Also, quote, adding acceleration to an already moving one, end of quote. The assumption in the USSR is, of course, that every action has a political character, as well as a purpose and result. Application and conditioned reflexes. With the intention and the objectives of the USSR and the nature of its propaganda spelled out in its own terms. It is now pertinent to investigate the basis of the application of its propaganda to the free world audiences. Whenever the Kremlin propagandists launch a propaganda campaign outside of the frontiers of their own heavily guarded territories, they draw upon their experiences with captive audiences and recruits to Kremlin communism. They draw upon the findings of the great Russian psychologist Ivan Petrovich Pavlov, the father of conditioning, of conditioned reflexes, theory of behavior. According to an outstanding American authority on this subject, we in the free world are treated like the dogs in Professor Pavlov's experiment. In these well-known experiments, the professor would ring a bell a few moments before feeding his dogs and repeat this practice until the dog would salivate as soon as they heard the ring. Thus, he induced them to respond to the sound of the bell, just as they did to the sight of the food, to associate the bell with their hunger. Later in the experiments, Pavlov changed the pitch or frequency of the bell signal or followed up with an electric shock instead of the expected food. He found out that he could bring on a neurotic condition in the dogs by scrambling the signals and by mixing the positive and negative cues. Once confused and neurotic, the dogs were easily susceptible to suggestion, and it was relatively simple to direct their behavior. Pavlov related this to the direction of behavior of humans by saying, quote, "The spoken word is tied up, thanks to the whole previous life of a grown man, with all his internal and external stimuli, and may cause all the actions and reactions of the organism, which are conditioned by these stimuli." End of quote. Proceeding from this position, Dr. George F. Sutherland, an American authority on Pavlov, holds that if, quote, "the statistical anticipation," end of quote, "of the future is interfered with, human beings will be deprived of the ability to deal realistically with their environment. Applying this theory to international affairs, Dr. Sutherland states that the Kremlin propagandists are deliberately trying to bring on neurosis among non-communist countries by means of manipulating positive and negative signals. From 1955 until 1959, he clipped headlines from newspapers which related to both Kremlin and Western activities on the four diplomatic fronts. The collection, containing some 5,000 clippings, was separated into two sections, for us and against us. At first, he thought that the Kremlin propaganda and political actions were themselves simply neurotic, but in the end he was convinced there was a definite pattern to their moves. The seemingly erratic measures and countermeasures of the Soviet world's powers in conducting their diplomatic affairs first suggested the possibility of a plan to create neurosis on a global scale. On one occasion, it inclined towards peaceful resettlement of world affairs, whereas on another objections were raised that made this impossible. He found that the Western world, like the animals in the experiments, showed little external effect, and the latent possibilities were disarmingly hidden from the victims. By 1957, the blowing hot and cold tactics of the Kremlin propagandists had created enough uncertainty and tensions to induce the Western world to consider elements of political compromise with the USSR. Simultaneously, faith abroad in the leadership of the United States started to waver. Then came Sputnik. Dr. Sutherland reports that by noon of the day that it was launched, American commentators were levying charges against their country of political and administrative incompetence, inadequacy of educational facilities, and ineptitude of research. The resultant change in mass attitude betrays its neurotic origin by its implied anxiety, self-deprecation, and disavowal of responsibility for what has been permitted to take place. Such emotional immaturity is a well-recognized characteristic of psychoneurosis and often hinders the patient from making a realistic appraisal of these difficulties and what he should do about them. Unfortunately, neuroses have a tendency to become self-perpetuating, and so are to be resistant to corrective actions. Then he added, "Such a lightning-like transformation in mass attitude is probably without parallel. This glaring illustration of a laboratory technique applied on a universal scale should alert us to the dangers ahead. End of quote. One need not believe that reflexes can be conditioned beyond a point or brains washed completely when the victim is a captive, much less if he is living in a free society. One need not believe either that the neurosis produced can last beyond the period that the victim is subject to conditioning. However, if the conditioning partly disorients thoughts and emotions and values, influences opinion, and directs action in the free world, its effects are dangerous and our continued security. The conclusion is inescapable that the Kremlin believes this theory does work. The carrot and stick statements of Khrushchev, the alternating of sweet talk with bellicose threats to exploit the free world's hope for peace and fear of war, is but one indication. Others are to be found in Kremlin campaigns of slander against us, of subversion of our people, and in the multiple slogans and propaganda tricks it performs with experienced dexterity. Chapter 3: Conquest by Propaganda. Kremlin propaganda helped produce a situation in Cuba which forced President Kennedy to make his declaration of April 20, 1961. It created for the United States a Pearl Harbor of the Cold War. A propaganda defeat we suffered only 90 miles from our own shore. However, like Pearl Harbor, such a dramatic battering from our enemy on territory close to our homes may be essential to alert us to the dangers of the aggression by propaganda that is the agitation of the USSR. A prototype which could have served as a warning to us occurred in 1947 and 1948 in the countries of Eastern Europe. Romania, as one example, fell under the dominion of the Kremlin in very much the same manner that Cuba had been doing. Reviewing what the USSR accomplished in that remote country gives us a clear indication of what the Kremlin has been accomplishing by its propaganda agitation operations with varying degrees of success in all corners of the globe. Ever since, it also suggests what the future holds for our dealings with Cuba's Castro and with other Kremlin agents, both witting and unwitting, in other Kremlin exploited trouble spots. The Kremlin propaganda agitation takeover of all countries follows a standard routine regardless of fundamental political, geographic, and cultural differences. Some of the minor propaganda techniques are given different emphasis, but beyond that, there is very little variation. This routine has been spelled out in a specialized blueprint of great value to revolutionary leaders such as Castro. For it and for key personnel to help implement it, they pay a high price in all instances. Eventually, too high a price. With respect to Cuba, one point is certain. If the Kremlin continues at its present rate of absorption of the country, Cuba will become tightly integrated into the empire of the USSR as Romania or any other captive Eastern European nation is now. The social and political backgrounds of both Cuba and Romania prior to the takeover were similar. Both were agricultural and were organized in large estates. Both had a type of military dictatorship which favored the landowners. A revolt unseated the dictator in Cuba, and World War II put an end to the Antonescu Iron Guard regime in Romania. Each country was ripe for some system which would really give a better break to more people. However, the past experiences of the two countries with the USSR held major differences. The Romanians knew and distrusted the Russians, while the Cubans neither know nor distrust them. The Kremlin gained military control first in Romania by occupying the country with its armed forces at the end of the World War II. Then it was able to easily operate indirectly to work through propaganda, agitation, infiltration, and subversion. In Cuba, the Kremlin was obliged to rely on propaganda, agitation alone, without the presence or threat of military force. The political deal was made in Romania through strong arm methods in 1945 and 1946 by Wyszynski, and in Cuba with a barter and persuasion in 1959 by Mikoyan. The early months in 1947 in Romania and until King Michael was forced out at Christmas time were similar politically to the days in Cuba, down to the United Nations meeting in September 1960. The parties leading the country were not called communist. In fact, it was officially denied in Romania that they were communist, just as Castro has been doing. Romania's prime minister, installed by Wyszynski, was the leader of a small group called the Plowmen's Front. Emphasis was on agrarian reform, as it is in Cuba. In both countries, the Communist Party used its energies to recruit members and to build up a reputation of championing the interests of the oppressed and unpossessing. Party members and agitators went tireless in Romania for identification. Castro's group affects fatigues and beards. In 1947, direct propaganda in the name of the USSR was carried on through the cultural and press attachés of the USSR embassy, as well as by the head diplomatic commissar himself. The major supporting organization in the direct category was called the Association for Strengthening Romanian Soviet Relations, or ARLIS, and as it spread its tentacles over the entire country at all educational levels. In Cuba, this type of propaganda organization had to wait until the establishment of diplomatic relations, which occurred in May 1960, but not so on the wholesale infiltration of local institutions by Kremlin crypto-communists or auxiliaries who took their propaganda to the trade unions, to the agrarian reform organizations, and to the army. They have operated through a network of international and national fronts, just as had been done in Romania. According to C.P. Capel, deputy director of the Central Intelligence Agency, in a New York Times story of August 22, 1959, it was then that a Kremlin intelligence officer arrived in Cuba to take over the training and directing of infiltrators into the Castro government. Assurances were generously proclaimed in both Romania and Cuba that the governments were not communist, that free, secret democratic elections would take place in the foreseeable future, that civil rights would be respected. The timing of the resurfacing of the direct Kremlin control in Romania was carefully and subtly worked out in advance. The stages of exposure were explained specifically to the success of infiltration and organization by Kremlin agents of the key government institutions, the military, the interior departments or police, the legal apparatus, the media of communications, the financial organization, and so on. The fact that there were reportedly only 12,000 communists in Cuba when Castro assumed power and an estimated 1,000 in Romania at the end of her participation in World War II was unimportant. This nucleus was organized and disciplined and part of the system, the Kremlin system. It is interesting to recall that the head of the Communist Party in Romania at the time of the takeover lasted only as long as he acted directly in the Kremlin's interests. He was a lawyer of standing even amongst non-communists, and he was appointed Minister of Justice. But when a sense of Romanian justice made him insist that the dispossessed be given the chance to put their talents to work for the country, he was removed and later executed. The Kremlin principle of reducing the people of education and talent to impotence and keeping them under rigid control was adamant. It was and is part of the formula for keeping entire countries under control. It is also interesting to recall that Fidel Castro was reported ill and for a time was not expected to attend the United Nations meeting in New York in the summer of 1960. At the last moment, he was cured and was able to make the trip. He too, like the admitted Kremlin communist Romanian leader, is essentially a nationalist without indoctrination training in the USSR, but for all practical purposes is an agent of the Kremlin and is expendable. Perhaps the most significant similarity in the takeover of these two countries from the United States' point of view is that we were and are singled out as a straw man to shout at as public enemy number one. The role we play today in all Kremlin propaganda until 1947 in Romania, their propagandists had a difficult time making this image stick. The Romanians moved to our side as they withdrew from the war. We had no territorial nor extraterritorial design upon their country, and we were offering post-war economic relief, which was incorporated in the Marshall Plan. Also, on the whole, we were not very well known by the people. At that time, we were not quite yet imperialists or colonialists in our own right in the Kremlin propaganda galaxy of epithets, but were closely associated with the British who were. In Cuba, the Yankee has long since been a symbol of power, therefore also an object of envy, fear, and dislike to the point of hate. Not only was there a revolution already made for the Kremlin to barter for, but there was a built-in, profitable propaganda image to draw upon. A century ago, Uncle Sam exchanged affection for respect in Latin America, just as is now happening in the world as a whole. Both dictatorships in Cuba and Romania, like dictatorships everywhere, require a focal point for public attention, a straw man to shoot at. Hitler chose the Jews, and the Kremlin has chosen the United States. By concentrating on the fears and animosities of the masses, the dictators divert attention from shortcomings in their totalitarian type of government and succeed in uniting their people in the first instance and in uniting them behind their regime in the second instance, because they feature the regime as champions of the security and interests of the people. The acquisition of Romania and progressive takeover of Cuba by the USSR have been made possible by propaganda techniques in two fairly distinct phases of operation. The first lasts until the gradually shifting balance of political control of the country tips the scales of over 51% in favor of the Kremlin agents. And the second lasts until the proclamation of Kremlin communist government is undertaken. In both phases, the primary purpose is to induce people to act on behalf of this process. All stimuli necessary to induce actions are employed. Threats and terror, bribery of the leaders with money and promises of power, bribery of the masses with promises of better living conditions and higher social status, strikes, demonstrations, riots. Victims need to be persuaded, not necessarily convinced, of the infallibility of the system. Also, in both phases, disorientation or conditioning reflexes play a large role to induce action. The regimes in Romania and Cuba both sought to gain control of the thinking of their subjects because this control is basic to the control of their actions, more fundamental than control by coercion. The first step was the acquisition of a monopoly of the communications, media, and the sources of information upon which the people could draw. The position taken by the Romanian communist officials on control of the information was practically the same as that proclaimed by Castro and his leaders. In 1947, it was held that the persistence of a pro-fascist mentality made it inexpedient for the Romanian press to have absolute freedom. The organ of the USSR occupation army in Bucharest wrote that the complete freedom of the press in Romania would be tantamount to pleading for fascism's right to take a share in Romanians' political life. Hence, freedom of expression could not be granted. Identical ideas were expressed by then Minister of Information, who said the government was in favor of complete freedom of the press for the people, for the masses, but that this freedom must be supervised by the government, lest it be misunderstood and be placed in the service of anti-democratic forces. Castro's views on freedom of thought and expression were stated in his speech on May 1, 1960. Democracy is that which guarantees to man not the right to freedom of thought, but rather the right to know how to think, the right to know how to write and he thinks, what he thinks, the right to know how to read what he or others think. This statement by Castro was augmented by his Minister of Education, who said that impartiality is a myth of civilization, and press reporters are conditioned by personal bias or are dominated by determined interests and ideologies. He announced that the only true basis for objectivity rests on alignment with public opinion, and the only true expression of public opinion comes from Castro. Therefore, when Castro spoke, he spoke for the people, and thus expressed public opinion. He concluded that if the press did not attune itself to public opinion, so described it, defend the interests of oligarchy. In Romania, prior to the publication of newspapers, periodicals, and pamphlets, books, and other readings matter first had to receive the approval of the Ministry of Information, which employed direct censorship through the Press Bureau, Office of the Censorship, the Office of Censorship, and had a domestic press section, which not only edited material, but also wrote in passages as it saw fit, and a foreign press section which censored foreign publications. Actually, direct, like indirect censorship, was supervised by the head of the political education section of the Romanian Communist Party, also head of the local agitprop, who placed his own personnel in key positions in the government and the trade unions. In addition to direct censorship, the Kremlin-dominated Romanian government used various indirect methods to promote the dissemination of approved views. Some of these methods were monopoly of news agencies and the radio industry, and partial or complete ownership of newspapers and periodicals, government subsidies or direct contributions by trade unions to newspapers and book publishing houses which followed the Kremlin Communist Party line, withholding legal authorizations from all but pro-government printing firms, strict but one-size observance of the law of libel and slander, preferential allotment of raw material, preferential allotment of credits by the nationalized National Bank of Romania, editorial interference by the Printers Union, and control of personnel through the Romanian Union of Writers, Journalists, and Artists, intimidation of workers employed by opposition or independent publishing plants, and control of distribution. All of the above methods were used against opposition and independent publications from the advent of the Kremlin-dominated government in March 1945 until December 1947, by which time all such publications had been completely eliminated. By February 1, 1948, the press expressed but one point of view, that of the Kremlin and the Romanian communists. Dissemination of news from abroad was also a state monopoly. All foreign news was distributed by the two government-controlled news agencies. On September 30th, 1947, the Associated Press and the regime's Azure Press signed an agreement under which the latter was to get the AP news file and distribute it to the local press, but the majority of the AP reports selected for the distribution under his arrangement were without political significance. In Havana, of the 16 Spanish-speaking newspapers in existence when Castro took over, only 3 were still under their original owner a year and a half later, and 2 of these were trade papers. Traditionally, as in Romania, almost no newspapers were self-supporting financially, but were subsidized originally by various political parties. As these parties were gradually turned into government parties, subsidies was withdrawn by the regime to force the paper out of business, or backing was continued if the paper was put out the required Kremlin line. Where this direct method was not considered thorough or fast enough, an indirect suppression was employed. In Bucharest, the head of the printers or typesetters union invaded the newspaper, seized the premises, and expelled the publishers in Havana. It was the head of the Union of Graphic Arts who led the expropriation. With the monopoly of the communication media by the regime, the blacking out of most sources of news and information, and the conditioning of thought for more than 2 years, it is a small wonder that the people in Cuba were not prepared psychologically for the abortive attempt at invasion in April 1961. Added to this was the usual Kremlin organization of terror under a secret agent police system, spying and reporting on neighbors for the tangible rewards of an iron discipline of control from the top. Under these circumstances, one could hardly expect the masses of Cubans even to realize that they were being given a chance of liberty. They do not yet know, as a mass, they are victims of the totalitarianism of the USSR. They still have the illusion that a pro-Kremlin a pro-Kremlin communist that is not a captive of the USSR, and a great deal of reagitation and reorientation will be required before they realize that they have been captured, along with Castro before the USSR is exposed, before Cuba finds herself responding to the oppression of the USSR, the way in which another captive nation of Eastern Europe did 5 years ago, Hungary, in an all-out revolution.